Hi everyone, I've never been on a call with all of you, so I wanted to say hi.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, this is very nice, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So I better start with my little presentation. I don't have a very long story because I wanted to give enough time for all of us to just talk, which seems to be the nicest thing here. I don't think we specified how long it would be exactly, but I think that if we can make it an hour in total, that would be good. And if you want to leave earlier, of course, just leave. That's fine. If you just want to hear my presentation. So it's a bit of a trial. We're just trying out how this works, and the idea would be that these webinars would happen pretty often, and that every time somebody else would come and give a talk, and other people can respond to their work, and that it would also be an inspiration for one of the podcasts that Kyle and I are going to be organizing. And this is the podcast Futures in Action, which is about cases like this. And so today, I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction because I know not everybody is sort of as close to anticipatory governance as maybe other people are, and then talk just some sort of like frank lessons, I guess, from the climate change, agriculture, and food security program and the scenario work that we've been doing in there for the last decade or so. And then we just talk about that and see what comes out. Does that sound good to everybody?
Sounds good.
Everybody's muted. Everybody's like, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say that we have a wonderful team at Utrecht and related to the various projects that I'll be talking about. So this is definitely not just my work. Kyle's over there as well, as you can see. So there's a bunch of great people involved with this stuff. And a lot of them are on the Slack in some form, maybe sometimes lurking. But yeah, so first to talk a little bit about anticipatory governance as a concept. So one of the things that I think is quite interesting here is that anticipatory governance as an idea has been around for some time and has been used by various communities. But what we're trying to do with, for instance, a paper that R.T. Gupta and I wrote some time ago and published in CCAFS, and also Carlijn Muiderman's PhD thesis, who was on the RIHN project on anticipatory governance, is to sort of use it as a concept for gathering different communities, right? So we have people working in future studies as academics, but also as practitioners. Then there's governance researchers, but of course also a lot of people who are actually working in sort of governance and policy spaces. And we really see anticipatory governance as a term that combines all these different interests. And the idea here would be to very broadly define it as all governance that is explicitly interested in longer term futures and incorporating ideas about future uncertainty in some form into governance processes. And then of course the academic study of that kind of work. Yeah, so the paper I was talking about with Arti was published last year and sort of provides an overview, a perspective on anticipatory governance. And maybe to say a little bit, so I'm originally somebody who's coming from a completely different field than political science and this sort of governance research. I'm originally a biologist and then did a PhD in sort of interdisciplinary sustainability science and participatory methods, and then started working at the University of Oxford at the Environmental Change Institute, where for many years we worked on the project that I'll be talking about, and working a lot with governments on kind of national planning and these kinds of things. And at some point really realizing that if you don't actually take governance research explicitly into account, you're kind of going blindly into these processes and they have a lot of kind of political implications there. So that's a little bit you could say unethical, right, in a way that there is so little governance literacy among people working on futures. So we're trying to sort of bring all this together. And so the type of questions that we're interested in asking is, why is a foresight or a futures process really undertaken? And this relates very much to who's funding the process, who's organizing, who's participating in the foresight process. How's the future conceptualized by these people, and including the funders, right? How do they think about whether the future is knowable, manageable or not, whether there's fundamental uncertainties, whether futures are socially constructed, right? You can have very different sort of basic ideas about what it means to engage with the future, and that informs everything else. And then what comes out of that is what diverse futures are imagined, and how do these relate to futures considered before? And then finally, what happens with that, right? So how do these futures impact policy choices upon policy choices in the present? So that's kind of an overview. By the way, maybe if you have like a sort of like an urgent question or something, just pipe up, and we can talk about it a little bit. But we can always go back to these slides later. So that's the sort of the critical questions that we're asking, aside from asking more maybe sort of like methodological questions about how can we best achieve, how can we improve futures approaches so that they impact policy better or whatever, to ask some more critical questions about what are the underlying dynamics under what we're doing and what others are doing. So I think that this may be a little bit baby future stuff for you guys, but just to quickly mention it, you can have very different ideas about the future, right? You can see it as something that's essentially predictable with some band of uncertainty around it, or you could say, well, actually, there's really irreducible uncertainty when we talk about the future, and the best we can do is develop these concrete, diverse future narratives to give us something to work with. And then what's very important here is that we can't even arguably really talk about speaking from one present, right? We're not only talking about multiple futures, we're also talking about multiple versions of the present and multiple versions of the past, depending on where you're standing. And that realization is very important, because if you open up the present and if you open up the past, then of course the future opens up, and you're better able to actually consider what kinds of things may happen according to different perspectives. There's a note here that Christoph Rupprecht, who is also in the Slack and in the Research Institute of Humanity and Nature in Kyoto, has taken this kind of idea and sort of run with it in a multi-species perspective as well, which is really interesting, I think. So let's talk a little bit of practice, right? This is sort of what we would be talking about in the podcast as well. So this is a project that falls under the program Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, which is a major program of the CGIAR. So one of their big programs is CCAFS. And so the CGIAR is arguably the world's biggest agricultural development research consortium / organization. They're everywhere. They're $1 billion US a year worth of funding, something like that. Anyway, very establishment, right? But so there is a climate change program in there, and in the program there's a scenario project that I've been leading for the last decade. And in this project, we're working in all these different global regions: South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, East Africa, West Africa, Central America, and the Andes. And we're working with a lot of partners everywhere. So just to explain a little bit about what we're up to in the project. So typically in these regions that we've been working on, we started by working together with all kinds of stakeholders in the region to develop regional scenarios that sort of hang sort of in sort of level of depth between global assessments and national level studies and local level studies. So the regional scenario analyses, starting as narratives, very much from a sort of like regional stakeholder perspective, and then we do some quantitative work using different agriculture economic models, different land use change models, and we also visualize these scenarios in different ways. So you imagine a set of different scenarios developed by different means for each of these regions, and then we use those scenarios to guide national policy. And so, for instance, the government of Honduras a few years ago had a draft national strategy for livestock and agriculture and in the context of climate change. And they asked the CCAFS scenarios team to help open up this process to a wide range of stakeholders, so that we're actively interested in getting many different perspectives involved in the development of this national strategy. And they saw scenarios as a good way to sort of open it up in terms of these different voices, and also crash test this plan against these different scenarios, and just make it better. So make it more inclusive, make it more legitimate, but also make it more future-proof in a way. So in a process like that, what happens is that we spend a lot of time with these policy teams and with stakeholders throughout a given context like this to actually work out what is the best moment to do this, who should be there, what should we be talking about, getting a lot of input in that. And then after maybe a year or something of very intensive work, and I have to say that the people that I just showed on the screen, a number of them are regional coordinators who are working day in, day out with policymakers on these kinds of processes. And Marieke Veger is the colleague in Latin America doing this work, along with other CCAFS colleagues. So we work very closely together on setting up sort of the right conditions for a scenario-based process with many different stakeholders. And so what we do then is imagine, for instance, it can be done in multiple workshops or in one workshop, but imagine, let's say it's one workshop. On the first day, we all go through the first draft of this plan. We have to establish what the government team that we're working with will accept in terms of input. But in this case, it was very open. They were basically like, we can just change almost everything, or actually everything about the plan if it seems that it's not feasible. And so there's a first round of sort of like basic review of the plan, from which are also drawn ideas about, okay, what should we be looking for when we're talking about the scenarios? What are sort of the key variables and the key things and the key elements that we're interested in? Then the regional scenarios that were developed at this higher level will then be used as a starting point to make country-specific and sort of sector-specific scenarios. So people will be using these regional scenarios, the narratives, the modeling, etc., as inspiration for writing their own stories about their country, about the case. And this worked quite well typically because people have something to run with, and we really allow them to basically just change a lot about these scenarios if it's appropriate. So you end up with really new scenarios, but they have some sort of DNA from the regional level, which also sort of helps bring in the global drivers, which is quite useful. And then these draft plans are tested in a very kind of detailed way against these different scenarios. And you can imagine if these scenarios were created with a lot of very critically different assumptions going into each of the scenarios, each scenario will have something very different. While the people who are using each scenario in a different group, they're sort of split up into groups working on these different scenarios, will have a very different opinion about the strengths and weaknesses of the plan that we're discussing. And so you get these completely different insights into these plans from these different scenarios, which is very useful. And then to say, okay, well, let's look at this. Let's look at what we can say about this. So all these different scenarios coming with these very different assumptions, what kind of common weaknesses and opportunities and benefits, etc., do they see in this draft strategy? So in other words, what are things that should be changed anyway? For instance, in Honduras, there was an entire dimension of sort of long-term climate adaptation that was really missing from the first draft. It was very sort of short-term focused. So there was an entire section added to the national strategy. But there may be other things that come up in one scenario that are actually super relevant more generally. It's just that they're not covered in the other ones. And yet other aspects that may be very much like eventualities that you should think about in terms of the sort of like adaptive, the ability to adapt this plan to certain eventualities, but they're not as something where you go, okay, this is definitely something we have to take into account regardless. The opposite is also typically true in these types of processes. What we do when there's nothing there yet, for instance, in Bangladesh, we worked on the 7th 5-year development plan at a stage where there was very little content to the plan, is first national scenarios are developed again from these regional sort of like overarching scenarios, and they are then discussed, and then we talk about, okay, so in this scenario, what are sort of the ideas that you would have about elements that should be in this national strategy. And then again, we review across these different scenarios to come up with sort of like robust or parts of a plan that seem to be working across all these different scenarios. And again, doing this has two benefits. It has benefits, or I mean, it has a bunch of benefits, but two main ones are just getting new insights on what you're talking about, but also getting a lot of the concerns of various groups and different actors on the table explicitly, right? Because if you don't do a process like this, the people in the room will be working implicitly with some kind of future or futures that they have in mind anyway. It's really impossible not to work with an implicit future in mind, right? And then, these futures could be dominated by certain powerful interests, for instance. So there's a sort of legitimacy thing going on here as well. So before I move on to talk about a few other things, maybe just to talk about how we got to all this stuff, because it's a big project, but we have been fighting for funding to be maintained for the project year on year. And it's it's an interesting story to briefly share, because just looking at the time, okay, yeah, because when I joined the CGIR and the CCAFS program, still based out of Oxford, this program is now in Utrecht, by the way, the organization, this entire $1 billion a year organization, was sort of in transition itself, because donor pressures from donor countries, etc., became very strongly kind of focused on impacts and outcomes, right? So outcomes and then impacts to really show with hard evidence as far as possible that what the work is doing is really having is really creating outcomes, which in turn should lead to on the ground impacts. And this created a lot of panic in the entire organization, because this has been a research organization that's been around for a few decades. And while they have been producing very kind of sort of practically relevant work, this kind of pressure was new. So everybody was sort of scrambling, like, how do we deal with this? And we, when I jumped into this scenario project, it was actually started before me. It was just this sort of typical, in a way, a sort of typical scenarios project where the idea was just, oh yeah, let's just do scenarios. Let's explore the future because that's cool, I guess. And we sort of had to work out as this pressure came in, okay, but why are we doing this, right? What is this for? And how can we find a way to make this clearly relevant? And it's a little bit mercenary in a way, where this pressure is on to show very quickly that you're doing something. And so you can imagine how we ended up with working very closely with national governments, because then you're working with the targeted partner with clear influence on these types of processes. And it will still take a few years, but at least you are clearly doing something to influence and to guide policy. But of course, you can have a lot of sort of like governance questions around this, right? Okay, so these are your main partners, and maybe vulnerable groups are sort of brought in, but very much on terms of the government. The pressure is coming from this sort of international donors who just want to, they just want to see impact, right? And so there's a lot of critique to be had against this program. But on the other hand, I have to say, now working more in a sort of with other projects that are more purely academic sometimes, that this kind of pressure to really show what you're doing has also transformed my thinking about scenario work and my thinking about the role of academia and society as well, because I can no longer do these kinds of projects and just sort of like accept that nothing's going to come out of them, and oh well, we're academia, so we can't have any impact. That's no longer. I mean, I know now that this work is possible, and I think that especially in sustainability work should sort of be something to aim for. And then maybe with the added, kind of like then to have more freedom and less pressure to perform at this sort of short. Sort of this very fast pace where it has to be clear at the end of the year that you're doing something which is clearly relevant. That's a little bit intense. Another lesson from this project is that we are working with people who are, for the most part, based in the regions that we're working in. So they have their networks. They know at least one of the countries in the regions quite well, and typically that's the country that we sort of focus on as a sort of base. So that's been fantastic. It also stopped me from flying a lot, because I used to be on a plane all the time, and now I'm not doing that anymore, which is great. So just to sort of, I have many more things to share about this project, but I'll shut up in a moment about this and just quickly talk about other things. So there's really interesting work that we've been doing, which is kind of the opposite of this sort of policy guidance, which is more about bottom-up transformation pathways using the seeds of good Anthropocenes approach. And one of the methods that we use there is 3 horizons, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But this idea that things in the present, sort of systems and structures in the present, also have to disappear. So that the question there in the bottom, what declines? for other things to have the space to, to emerge. And there's a lot of conflict involved, and there are winners and losers, and it really depends on different enabling conditions. So that's a really interesting approach to use, leads to many wonderful pathways. And that's a really exciting sort of direction that's sort of running in parallel to this more kind of policy focused work. And then, as some of you probably know, I have this project Anticipate, this new project where we're really looking at games and governance and the unique potential of simulation games, using different roles and rules and co-design to really explore how things are organized. And I think that's it for now, because I've been talking for a long time and I feel slightly awkward just talking into a microphone instead of an audience. But yeah, I hope that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I guess if everyone wants to maybe use a stack system here to ask questions, if we've got a lot of traffic, we can do that. If you just type in chat, I'll keep track of the stack. And otherwise, feel free to pipe up with questions or comments you might have. Okay, well, I'll maybe get started with some questions then. So I guess this idea of sort of testing the research outcomes is quite interesting. And how would you see that integrating in, I guess, a smaller scale project than one that's like driven by large scale international organizations?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Actually, in the paper, this where is it? This paper with Arti, we compare these two cases, and it sort of answers the question in a way, Kyle, because it's we sort of compare. We ask these critical questions about the CCAFS project that I've just been talking about, and then about another project called with a very strange name, Mungo, which is a research project on the future of food in Europe, and that didn't have this sort of hard pressure to achieve outcomes and impacts. But because some of us were involved in it, we were still interested in doing something that actually made an impact, And so, but the difference was that we were able to engage with different kinds of actors to start with. So we could do it much more bottom up. So we started with, instead of the national governments, we started with alternative local food networks and communities to develop futures for them and to capacitate, sort of the sort of with visioning and backcasting the imagination of these people to create long-term visions for their work. And then we upscaled that and we sort of aggregated that into larger scale futures that we then use with the European Commission. And so with these smaller projects, in a way, it's, well, I mean, I think that the difference is that you can then choose who to work with, right? So you have to be very careful about whose voices should be playing a role in these kinds of conversations. And actually, the Transmungo project had a very different goal from the CCAFS project, which is this idea of like outcomes and impacts at the national level that lead to really large scale on the ground impact. There, it was really about opening up the food discourse, a discourse around the future of food in Europe, which is very vague, right? So it's just then you're just measuring what kind of ideas are coming up in European policy and political discussions around food. But that's, I mean, I think that's also very important if you think of it from a sort of transformation perspective, just to open up that futures space. But at the local level, and that was quite hard actually, but at the local level, this project was quite successful because you can, again, if you're working with sort of local researchers and local people in these communities, you can really go through this process. You can take a large number of steps, you can iterate, you can talk again and again and again and again, and really guide this kind of work. There's a wonderful paper by Aniek Heding, who is a researcher now, a postdoc at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, and who I supervised as a PhD researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And Aniek has compared some of these cases, some CCAFS cases and some Transmungo cases, in terms of some of the conditions for guiding guiding these different actors towards real action. So going from imagining different futures to actually starting to initiate these different futures. So I'm sure that Anique will be on one of these webinars as well, because she's great. So.
Excellent.
Does that answer your question, Kyle?
Yes, I think so. So there's kind of like on a smaller scale, there's a possibility of, I guess, iteration, discussion with the stakeholders in the project, and then kind of maybe developing criteria for analyzing the success of the project with those stakeholders.
Yeah, so you start typically. So it's interesting because there's sort of two levels. There with these types of processes, there was often a much more heavy visioning and backcasting kind of component where people were really creating, their sort of like long-term goals and ideas about the future of their organization and their context, and then doing this backcasting process where you walk back step by step to say what's needed to achieve that goal. What's the step just before that? What's the step just before that? And how do we get to the present? Which is a wonderful process because that just really is very useful for these organizations. I remember a process in Wales where we were talking about sort of creating an integrated food strategy for Wales, and that went from a sort of a strategy. One of the groups that I was in went from a strategy that was sort of like 15 years out, all the way back as it to a point where there was a note where this person is literally going to have a meeting with the Sustainable Development Goals Officer of the Welsh Government tomorrow, and if Joost can quickly write up the notes from the meeting, and then this person can take them into that meeting and start discussing how to actually implement this. And so this is, I think, a very important thing to sort of realize when you're doing this kind of work and you really want to see an impact. Well, it depends, but if it's about specific strategies, is to be very concrete. Just be very concrete and don't underestimate the need to really focus on the short term and what kind of actions need to be taken tomorrow. That's sort of the level of this sort of like total backcasting, but the process design around that kind of activity, you also have to talk very carefully about what does it mean for each of us for this foresight process to be successful, right? How do we see this as successful? What is possible? What is not possible? And then to sort of like work back from there as well.
All right. Yeah. So that's very good to take away from this. Are there any other questions that people may have?
Maybe just to build on that quickly, I kind of come from a space that's a lot more like top-down traditionally in scenario development, and so I'm really interested in kind of branching more into this, stakeholder-driven, bottom-up approach. You did have a slide that showed a few different quantitative pathways. Yeah, this one. And you're speaking about how you kind of, iterate off a backbone quantitative scenario, and it looks like you have kind of the SSPs up there for Cambodia. Could you just kind of speak more about how, maybe what those iteration rounds look like, and how, I mean, I don't know if backcasting is the technique that's used to leverage against these the SSPs to create these different scenarios, but kind of how those iteration rounds play out.
Yeah, really good question. So my thinking about this has changed significantly throughout the year. So in these examples that we're showing here, basically the idea would be that the work starts in a qualitative mode, and then we translate these scenarios to sort of modeling assumptions. But the way that we did that, we tried a lot of different things. So we tried sort of like fuzzy sets and sort of conceptual mapping and all kinds of stuff, and sort of ranges of numbers and all these things. But ultimately, what we realized is that, and of course also based on literature, is that the logic that why are people choosing certain numbers? Why do they say, oh, it's going down, it's going up, what's happening to the GDP, blah, blah, is more important to the modelers than having a number, because we're working with stakeholders who don't necessarily know, who can't just give you these numbers. but they have certain logics, right? And so then in the sort of, let's say the example in Honduras, or for instance, when we were working on the national strategy, there would be a moment where people would be reviewing model results for in Central America, and then we would tell them, okay, have a look at this. These are some of the scenario results that are relevant to your scenario, but we want you to be critical because it may be that this is way too, these are global models. This may be way too sort of like coarse-grained, and that you have a very different understanding. And then what you would typically see is that people, they know enough about their own country's context in that sense. When they're looking at maps or when they're looking at numbers, when it's about commodities or something, they say, okay, this is something we could work with. This is something we think is unreasonable. We would have the modelers who are responsible for these outputs in the room with the groups. And so the attitude would be very much like, okay, the model results are a conversation partner. They're there to talk and give a different perspective. It doesn't mean that it's true or anything necessarily. It's just there to give another sort of like view on the whole thing. And so the modelers were also there really as conversation partners with the other experts. And as time has gone on, I believe that sort of like forcing models to reproduce as closely as possible as stakeholder scenarios is maybe a bit unreasonable, because I think the models, they're asking different questions. It's, to a degree, it's about integrative sort of assessment, but the sort of like all the interactions that you can describe in qualitative scenarios where it's all these different dimensions playing into each other. In some ways, models can do that in a way that humans can't, but they are also limited in ways that humans are not. So I also think that it's also valuable to have the models ask very specific questions. For instance, like what happens if we regionalize European, livestock production or something to a more sort of regional or local level? What does that do in this model, rather than shoving a bunch of different assumptions in there all together and then having no clue anymore why the results look the way they do, right? So
Yeah, thanks for that. I think your little quote, the model result, having the model result as a conversation partner is a really good way to think about it, I think. Nice.
Yeah, a few years ago at Anticipation Conference, somebody asked me, so how do you get people to believe this modeling work? And I told them, I'm trying to get them not to believe it, I want them to be critical, because policymakers are often in this mode of like, well, we will only be involved in the scenario process if, we can see some modeling or something, right? And if it's just qualitative work, then we're not interested. And that's a mindset, of course, comes with many people being trained in a sort of like traditional command and control sort of risk reduction mindset that we sort of want to let loose a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Very illuminating.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, Joost, thanks for breaking all this down. Sometimes I wonder, because I'm a lot newer to a lot of this than most of you are, and I wonder where some of my past and current experience fits. But looking at this side particularly, and looking at stakeholder level engagement, I'm just curious about who some of those stakeholders were, like some groups you worked with from the community level, if there were. Because looking at some of this, I find more relevance in going forward, because when I worked with Oxfam, we did a lot of flood resilience, capacity building in communities. There was a lot of looking at the future of an area and what kind of risk there is and what you do with it at all kinds of like community level, government level. So I mean, it just helps me think about futures work a little bit easier. So thanks. And what kind of community groups have you worked with, and what were their responses as you go through this process? Like what's that like?
Yeah, so what we typically try to do is very carefully create a sort of like representation of people from different issues, especially that are maybe not normally coming up in these kinds of processes. So, for instance, CCAFS as an organization is very interested in thinking about changing gender roles and sort of like the future of youth and these kinds of things. So these kinds of groups will be there, and almost inevitably the conversations get most sort of heated around some of the deep inequalities in the country, and also issues around corruption, and etc. So that's I mean, that's another thing that I think the narrative scenario work, the qualitative scenario work really can do. That it's much harder with the quantitative work. It's actually talk about deeply rooted structural inequalities and problems. So I mean, of course, once everybody's in the room, it's a measure of really carefully facilitating this. One example that I really liked is a few years ago we did a process in Ghana, which was actually a multi-level scenarios process. A paper about that is soon coming out from my good friend, colleague Ariella Helpert, and was facilitating this, and it was her project, which was basically local scenarios all the way up to national scenarios, then connected to the work we were already doing, regional scenarios for the West Africa region, and then global scenarios. And a way to sort of deal with getting everybody's voices on the table was to separate at some point the local communities out from the national level decision makers and the sort of ECOWAS, West Africa regional level people and the district level people. Because then there was space for everybody to speak, and then to create mixed groups across those different levels to talk about connects and disconnects between them, which was a very valuable thing to do. So to sort of create safe spaces for people to acknowledge that there are power differences in the room, but then also mix them up. And once you've got everybody's ideas on the table, they can't, because then it's up to the facilitator to make sure that these ideas keep being there, right? That's one way to deal with it. And for instance, an example from sort of like community level perspective is that some of these scenarios that were originally made for the West African region, one of them had to do with many different NGOs and organizations constantly vying for the attention of people in vulnerable communities and coming in and another program and another program. And that just looks very different from the level of a town than from the level of ECOWAS, right? And to be able to mix all of that together and then have the modeling and then have all this stuff in there is pretty interesting. Yeah, not easy.
Okay. No. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that was it. I mean, one other thing that was a lesson with that kind of process where people are coming from maybe coming from far away, etc., is to really facilitate everybody coming to the same room, right? So actually,
especially in Africa,
made sure that people would have transport, that they would come, that everybody would be there. And you're talking both about the people who have to come from a distant village, but also as well as the ECOWAS policymaker who has very little time, right? So to facilitate that, you just need a lot of time and a lot of sort of like resources and people's time to actually bring people together to do that. And I've been in processes where that was the case and everything has been set up like that. And then the methods really start to shine because then they are enabled to do their work. And I've also been in processes where maybe, it wasn't my process or anything, where almost all the assumptions that were made and all the way that it was set up were just wrong and only fail, if they're not the right people are not in the room and the way that the whole thing is framed isn't correct, then it's just bound to fail. So.
Oh, thanks. Oh my God, yes, and I totally understand about getting people in the room, especially when you have to bring different types in, and sometimes literacy. Did you ever have to deal with the fact that some people weren't at the same literacy levels?
Yeah, and so what we sort of typically try to do is keep the written elements of the workshops quite light anyway, if that's a problem. Use visualization, use sort of like collages and things like that.
So, and one of the things that just strikes me as important when you have scenarios but also modeling is exactly what you mentioned a few minutes back about how, especially in Africa and in many places actually, but more in parts of Africa where NGOs and different governments just come in and it's program after program, and sometimes you're doing the same thing year in and year out for 10 years, 15 years. But if you have already built that capacity for local people in organizations or not to look at models over a span of time. They just have more control over that. Oh, are we doing this again? Because there is so much repetitive programming for the sake. And I've noticed that more in Africa than in Wales. So it's nice that this kind of modeling can give that sense of, oh, we actually have a narrative we've developed about what our future looks like. So that's pretty powerful when a lot of your life depends on who's coming in and funding and helping your village or your city.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the maps that you see at the top of this slide here, what we would do, for instance, is print out these maps and ask people, okay, this is the scenario that was created originally inspired by sort of regional perspectives, but then it was sort of fed through this land use change model, and the model has a lot of problems, and these are all the problems with the model, and it flattens a lot of the assumptions. So let's take a pen and let's go on this map and be like, okay, I don't believe that this will happen for these reasons. I don't think that this urban area will expand like this. I see developments there, and I think it's there. So you're basically like improving the model results, even though we are also very careful because you are still framing things by even having a map like this. But just to basically say, okay, you are the experts on the ground. You know your country, you know your region, you know your district. What do you think of this bullshit? Is this fine, or what are we going to do with this? Is this useful? And that attitude really coming in very strongly with that attitude, like it's basically trash, these models. And the modelers that we are bringing along will also say this, right? Honest modelers, let's say, or reflexive modelers, maybe, they are very happy to see that people are questioning this stuff, right? And that's what they would like. I heard a colleague once tell me, oh, it's great because you can really see that people are developing sort of literacy for reading models critically, and that's really what we want. So, yeah.
Thanks. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good questions.
All right.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Grace. I have a question. It's maybe a bit more of a broad question, and on the side of the stakeholders, like the locals specifically. So I wonder how you get their buy-in, or how do you manage the relationship with the locals when you are asking them to think about the future and to imagine the future, when a lot of these communities, probably I'm from Mexico myself, so, and I work with a lot of these type of communities. So I wonder how do you manage to help them think about the future when you need to get through the day-to-day? You know what I mean? I think if I've come across a lot of these type of projects, and I actually hosted one of these APF festivals recently, and we had one woman from Nigeria doing amazing, no, from Kenya, sorry, doing amazing work on sexual reproductive rights. And a lot of what she was kind of communicating is that it's really hard for them, for the community, to think about the future when they're like fighting for the today and tomorrow.
Yeah. No,
You know what I mean? So it's just, yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, generally about these projects, but also in general about foresight, I think that's one of the probably challenges that we face. Yeah, that is quite different from the developed world, right? So I wonder if you have some tactics. You mentioned briefly that probably backcasting also helps them kind of understand what are the steps they need to take to get there. But yeah, I don't know if you have any other thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is that it's sort of in the developing world context, when we're working at that, I mean, the example that I just described with the sort of like multi-level process is really one of my favorite ones, and I would like to see us do much more of that. But many of our processes have been sort of at the national level, and then bringing in representatives of communities, and often this is a situation where you have an association of some sort, or it's an NGO, standing in for people's concerns, which of course is far from perfect, right? And then, but we do want to make sure that we do have representatives sort of from the areas that we're maybe talking about, etc. But it's not a perfect situation. But I would say that, like you said, I think, and it's also my experience in Europe actually, when it's not really about survival, but people are just busy doing the day-to-day, and they don't really have time to think about the long term, and it's costing them money to get away and do that. is to really focus on these kinds of methods where you just help them plan and they can come away with something where they have an idea about how to do things differently in the next year or two, right? So it's a long-term perspective. They spend a bit of time in the longer-term future and then looking back and backcasting and discussing actions to be taken, new organizations, new collaborations to be set up that just actually, not bullshitting, but actually like help people deal with their resilience in ways that helps them in the next year, in the next 2 years. What also can help is, and of course, this is maybe a little bit political, but to have small incentives, right? To have sort of like funding that if they're involved in this process, go through it, that they can actually use their funding to do some of these things that they've come up with, to sort of have seed funding for some of these projects. I've seen that happen as well. But it's it's not easy, and and we are also not a hammer looking for a nail, right? If foresight isn't the way to go in some cases, then screw it. Let's not do foresight, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not here to sell foresight. We're here to help solve societal problems. So, right?
Right. No, yeah, I agree. But I think I'm a futurist myself as well, and I think that thinking about the future is very important anywhere you are, right? Like it's not just kind of trying to sell them foresight, but sell them futurist thinking as a thing. Like you need to think about a bit farther in the future. But I've realized that if for us, as you're saying, maybe also in Europe. I think about the 5 years. I'm sure that for them, for communities, for locals, is much harder to think about 5, let alone 10.
Yeah. So as long as they come out of it with some valuable things to do in the next couple of months that are really different from what they've thought about before, then it could be valuable, right?
Right.
I think that's really the approach, and you get the same problem. And I mean, it's not about survival or the day-to-day, but I mean, in a way, it is. You get the same problem with policymakers, right? They don't want to think 30 years ahead because they have a 4-year time horizon, and so there it's the same question. Like you have to make it clear, this is going to help you be, better able to integrate your thinking about the future, but it's going to yield a bunch of stuff that you can start doing now. So. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say something about that too, just having also worked with people and who haven't really, sometimes the inability to imagine the future is, you can all hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, because it says like my things off on the side. It's just like both through personal and also community experience, I've realized that sometimes when some people, when they're lost in that day-to-day struggle, which is extremely stressful and can take over your whole life and your whole psyche and your ability to function, for some, just being able to imagine having control over the next 6 months to a few years about some of your environment and some of the things that affect you, whether it's the natural environment or how you're earning a living, the skills you have, etc. You can just being able to see that in a longer term range is itself is powerful. So I think it works differently for different people, but I have seen that I've seen the change and the change in attitude and the change in motivation in people who suddenly thought, oh my gosh, I can own this cooperative. I mean, we can work towards something that's more than our day-to-day, let's buy this rice and sell. I'm talking completely from the West African experience I had with them. And it was amazing to see. It was amazing to see the change in their attitude, their motivation, and their mood over time, and how much they started to do just because they could suddenly see a future for themselves they never really thought was possible, or didn't suspect was as possible as easily as it seemed after after mapping out the potential. So there's both sides to that. So the tools do help as well. And I guess what Joost said about multi-level planning, rather than leaving people with lots of fancy, amazing models is helpful.
Yeah,
right.
totally
No,
agree.
thank you so much. I agree.
Yeah, I agree as well. And I think that the more, I mean, always really, but the more you're dealing with people who are really struggling, the more important it is to just start with them, right? Start with what they need, and then find out what are the tools that they can use to sort of like create that empowerment and sort of strength-based approaches. Again, I'll as soon as that paper with Ariella comes out, I'll share it because it's very much about this. I have a PhD student, a PhD researcher, Madelon Eelderik, who works on participatory action research, who has very similar insights like this as well. That's just immensely empowering. And I think that I probably speak for a bunch of us that sort of empowerment is what gets us out of the bed in the morning, right? It's what stimulates us to do this work, really. So if you can do that, it means listening very carefully, it means opening the process up entirely, and then from there coming up with these futures that do inspire people to move beyond the day to day. And again, I mean, I see that at all levels. It's less urgent at the level of policymakers, maybe personally, but many policymakers are also just like putting out fires, you know. So. Yeah, good.
Joost, I have one more question.
So yeah.
What do you find the most exciting about this work? Like, which part of this really gets you excited and motivated to keep going?
Oh, so many things, but I think sort of what I was just talking about, like the moment where you're sitting around with people going through a process like this, whether it's foresight or games or whatever, and everybody together is like goes, you know, I've never thought about it like that before. There's an entire new reality opening up in my mind, including in my mind, right? Because we're all doing this together as a facilitator and as and to just get a new perspective on everything, and to help people do that and help sort of create it together, and then have something that really people can really take away. That's you know that energy, right? Everybody's in like, whoa, yeah, I thought about it like this before. It's amazing actually, and everybody's smiling, and it's like, okay, I'm seeing things completely differently now. I think that's just the best feeling in the world. So.
That's true, I agree. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. We have time for maybe one more question, and then we have to close it down. But everybody maybe needs to go as well. Because
we are coming up on the hour.
Maybe we leave it like this. Well, I think that was really great to do. Thanks everybody for coming in and listening and asking wonderful questions and discussing. So Kyle, you've been recording this, I think?
Yes, we'll have it up on the YouTube channel, Anticipatory Governance YouTube channel, and we will be doing future sessions like this.
Yeah, for sure. And we will also be turning this topic at least into a podcast, and we can take your questions along, so we can sort of report back on what we've discussed here and mention what people have been saying and sort of discuss it a little bit in the podcast as well, which would be a fun way to do it, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks so much everybody for tuning in, and we'll announce the next one very shortly. And of course everybody here is also welcome to be involved in one of these webinars and get the presentation themselves, huh?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, amazing.
If you would like to participate or host one of these, please just direct message me on the Slack, and we'll make it happen.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for doing,
Everyone.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Good to
Have a
connect.
nice
Bye.
weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.